Welcome back to Speed Demon Painting, where we are continuing our series on how to paint the Enlightened support squadrons that were sent to me by Warcradle Studios. Now, in the first video we were talking or looking over the base codes, the applications, how to do all of them, and this second part is dedicated more towards the longest part of any painting process, being the detailing. Now, after we've done all the base codes in our previous video, it's time to get down to picking out some of the details. I started off with doing the regular white metals, and for this I used Iron Hand Steel by Games Workshop. It's a good paint, does require two thin coats, but they often do. I'm also using gold, using Retributor armor. However, I find Retributor armor to be very bright and a bit too bright for the subdued color scheme I'm going for. And a little trick I have to give it a bit of extra covering power is to add a small amount of purple into it. If you do that to your gold paint, it will of course darken it down, it will be a bit less shiny, and for your first base coats that's not necessarily a bad thing. Now you always want to add a touch of water of course to do this, and yeah, then you just start working your way around the fleet, picking out any of the details you want to be gold. You definitely want to make sure that this paint is not too thick and goopy, because they're going on the weapons, and those weapons have some incredibly fine detail that need to be worked in, more on which later down the video. And then yeah, once those detailings are done, the metallics are done, I just quickly use some grey sear to pick out the bits that are supposed to be glowy later down the line. I use some grey sear straight from the pot, but I'm picking out details that are sort of on an elevated level, that are higher up. And I know painting straight from the pot is considered heresy by some, but if you're picking out raised details like that, there really isn't much of an issue if you use a slightly thicker paint. I do this before applying the all-over wash. I really love the Army Painter Dark Tone, the synthetic version, not the watered down, the water-based one. But I do think it's a bit too thick and gloopy, so I always thin it down somewhat, which I'm doing here with some mineral spirits, or white spirit as it's called over here. Don't use your best brush for this, it really just ruins them. This is an old brush I mainly use for this sort of thing, or for scenery work. Now, this is not a water-based paint, it's a synthetic paint, and if you apply it too thickly, it will just start gooping up all of your details. So the trick to it is to start applying a thin coat at the start, and it has a very long working time, so as you apply it, just try to get it all over the model. You can always take parts of it off later down as well, which is why I have that piece of tissue at the ready. If you ever feel like you've done or you've applied too much of it, you can always just take it off, dab off the excess with your brush. It does tend to leave bubbles, so you do have to blow it every now and then to remove those, which is what I'm doing here. And like I said, here I'm just going over it again, removing too much of the excess. I don't like dipping it in like some of the commercials suggest you do. I just apply it by hand in a controlled fashion. It does dry completely shiny, but once it's done, I hit it with a coat of matte varnish, so you can start continuing on to it. And this is essentially the result about 24 hours later, after everything is cured, because it does have a very long curing time. As you can see, here's the small things. It does knock off all of the shine of your metallics, sadly, because you have to apply that matte varnish after you're done. So one of the first things I've done after it's all dry is to take my gold again, pure gold this time, didn't mix it in with any of the purple, just start applying a bit of a dry brush to get some of that metallic luster back that was lost using the matte finish on it. You should just go over it, make sure you don't get any of the paint in the recesses, and just pick out those metallics, again using my trusty little bullet tipped dry brush that I got from the makeup shop. Now, once all of that was done, it's time to go on to the weathering. Now, To do this, I've mixed up a bit of Vallejo rust pigments along with that same matte varnish that I've been using before. I pre-mixed it in a tube dropper bottle that you can just get off of eBay, I think. However, this mixture is quite strong. It has quite a lot of pigments in it, more so than I want for my models. So you can always thin it down, which is what I'm going to be doing here. I just use that same matte varnish that I always use, which is from Winsor & Newton, the Galleria series, and just add a few extra drops next to it. It is messy work. I did spill, sadly, in this video. That bottle is great. It's very cheap for the amount of matte varnish you get. However, it is a nightmare and you quite often spill, which is what happened here. Luckily though, if you get it on your models that have already been matte finished, it's not much of an issue, is it? I mix everything together, those pigments, add a touch of water again just to get a bit of a better flow, which is something that you should always do. Also using a dry palette for this, because if you're using this on a wet palette, it does tend to sort of make it dry too quickly. Now this weathering wash is just something you can apply straight onto your metallics, which I'm doing here. It will find its way into the recesses, which is essentially where rust would build up anyway. And it doesn't just run into the recesses though, it leaves a very fine grainy film on the metallics that I kind of like, because you do have some slight tarnish all over your metals, especially when you're at sea, I should imagine. And I can't imagine the Covenant of the Enlightened being a faction that is very heavy on manpower to keep everything cleaned up, like some of the more military powerhouses of the dystopian age would. So just going around applying this this wash, not just on the metallics though. I'm focusing on it first at the start, because around the metals is where I want it to be the most concentrated. Those are the parts that are going to be rusting more readily. But as we continue, I'm starting to apply it essentially all over the hull. And the great thing is you can just wipe your finger across it just to get it off of the most prominent areas. It does leave your hands quite messy at the end of the painting session, but there you go. I mean, it's not the end of the world if your models end up looking more like you want them in the end, right? And this wash really does creep into the recesses quite nicely, and it works quite well with the already applied dark tone that we did. Sadly, doing so many washing steps, it does knock back some of the highlights we've applied with the dry brush in the first video. So I'm just getting that pale grey blue, the color that we originally used to apply the edge highlights. I'm just dabbing it on a dry palette off the side of the camera here. The trick to dry brushing, as we've discussed, is not to just use the paper to get most of it off, but to run it by the back of your hand quite a few times until most of it is done. And then this time around, it's not just a wild all over application like I did the first time. I'm really trying to aim for the rivets, the sharp edges of the model, and treating it more like I would an edge highlight. However, still using that incredibly light dry brush touch to bring out those details that, well, weren't lost per se, but were quite subdued with all of the other washes that we were applying in the later steps of the paint job. So this is just a way to, you know, bring that back out. I do the exact same thing for the silver. Much like the gold details, the silver did lose some of its punch with all of that, all of those matte finishes that we've been using so far. So I'm just getting out that trusty old tiny dry brush again and going over all of the silver parts using the silver dry brush. Again, same technique. Make sure you wipe most of it off on the back of your hand and just have at it. You can even have a go at the gold metallics if you are very light to the touch. When dry brushing, the amount of pressure you apply to your brush is quite important. When you do it, if you just go over it very lightly, you can get away with dry brushing a light bit of silver onto some golds as well for some sharp edge highlights, which is what I'm doing here. Now, onto the by far most tedious and longer lasting part, doing the weapons in that typical orange glow. This is Vallejo Fluo Orange. It's a great color, but if you're not applying it over a bit of a white background, it's not going to have much of a punch. So it's detailing time, and this is the only time when I actually get out my good brushes. I like using the Raphael 8404 series. I like it good, bristles on it, very fine tip, but don't use it for your grunt work if you will, only use it for the fine applications. Run it across the back of your hand to make sure you've got a nice little sharp tip to it, and then it's just a case of bracing your hands as well as you can, making sure you're limited in your motion somewhat, but still freely. It's hard to explain what that is like. And just start filling in all of the gaps you want to be glowing. It's also a good tip if you're working this finely to regularly clean out your brush. If that paint starts hardening inside of the tip of your brush, you can try to apply a fine layer of paint as many times as you want. If it's not flowing, it's not going to work. So it's a case of being patient, constantly cleaning out your brush and just applying it wherever you want, and just slightly running it across the back of your hand. Make sure you've got a very nice and sharp tip to it. I'm again trying to pick out some of the recessed parts in Noodle's glowing, what are they, sort of engine parts on the superstructure. When we take a closer look at it, you see it's just 3 very fine lines applied on the inside of it. I essentially do the exact same thing for where I want the glow to come out. Just apply a bit of white down the center. Once all of that is done, we can actually start moving on to the fluo paint. It's a very gel-ish like structure that the fluo paint has. It's very thick, but regardless, it dries quite transparent. You do want to add some water to it, but don't go overboard. If you water it down too much, you're not going to be working with any pigment whatsoever. And the fact that it has this sort of a thicker gel structure means you can really guide it into the recesses, or onto some raised areas. So it's just a case of experimenting and getting the dilution down to where you want it to be. I am now expertly applying this paint off camera, but I think I realized my mistake quite early on during this footage and come back. Now, like I said, it's a gel-like structure. It really does find its way quite neatly into any of those recesses, as is demonstrated here on this cruiser. I do have to get very close. My eyesight isn't quite what it used to be. I sometimes have to use magnifying glasses even, especially when doing faces, just to get it there. And as you can see, cheekily, if I've got a bit too much on my brush, I don't mind getting my hands dirty and just flicking it off. This is what it looks like up close and personal, and when it dries out where there is no white background to it, it will end up significantly darker compared to where you applied the white paint, which is why I'm going through all of this well, somewhat tedious work of picking out all of the white details first. I can't stress it enough. You really have to when you're applying these orange paints. It was especially tedious doing all of the pulse broadside weapons on the small little submarines, but at the end of the day, I'm quite happy that I did it for my fleet this way, because it's a very simple scheme. It's quite fast, and you do want to have an eye catcher somewhere on your models, which is exactly what these glowing weapons are supposed to be. And this is them compared to my old ships. So as you can see, quite consistent with the bright orange coming over. New ships are quite a bit larger, like I said in the review, so I don't mind that at all. And these are 2 cruisers compared to each other. I hope you liked it. There's only one small bit left, and that is to do the visitor tokens, which will be part 3 of the whole review. And I hope to see you then.